When I reached the age of 18, I encountered one of the most tumultuous and emotionally charged periods of my life. It all began when I uncovered the devastating truth that my mother, whom I had always believed to be my primary caregiver, had deceitfully diverted the entirety of my college fund to finance her fourth wedding. This revelation left me feeling both betrayed and determined to take action. In a bold and calculated move, I decided to confront her publicly by crashing her wedding ceremony. I designed a custom t-shirt that boldly labeled her a gold digger, a stark accusation that laid bare her unscrupulous actions. The moment was charged with tension as I walked into the ceremony, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and resolve. The t-shirt became a symbol of my defiance, drawing gasps and murmurs from the attendees. The climax of my plan came when, amidst the chaos and the mounting pressure from family members who had long harbored suspicions about her intentions, law enforcement was called to the scene. The culmination of my efforts led to her arrest, a moment that felt both vindicating and heartbreaking. The strained relationship between my mother and me has deep roots, stretching back to my childhood. Losing my grandmother at the age of 18 was a pivotal moment that reshaped my understanding of family dynamics. She was an indomitable woman, a no-nonsense entrepreneur who successfully ran her own upholstery business for an impressive 50 years. Beyond her professional accomplishments, she was the backbone of our family, single-handedly raising 3 children with unwavering strength and resilience. My mother, being the middle child, often found herself in constant conflict with my grandmother. As a child, I frequently witnessed their heated arguments over minor disagreements, which left me puzzled and seeking answers. It wasn't until much later that I discovered the painful truth: my grandmother harbored a deep-seated resentment towards my mother, stemming from her feelings about me. According to my aunt, my parents never genuinely wanted me, and from the very moment I was born, there was an undercurrent of bitterness directed at me. During the first 6 months of my life, I lived with my mother and grandmother. However, as I began to grow, my grandmother took a firm stance, insisting that my parents step up and take full responsibility for raising me. This transition was fraught with challenges. I was subjected to a barrage of derogatory names, particularly from my father, who would call me names like bimbo or dumbo for the slightest mistakes. These hurtful labels stood in stark contrast to my academic achievements, as I turned out to be the most academically inclined among my cousins. My parents had always encouraged my educational pursuits, fostering a passion for science that led me to aspire to a degree in the field. Despite their support, my relationship with them was strained. They punished me harshly for what they considered trivial transgressions: wearing nail polish, engaging in conversations with boys, or even wearing what they deemed as revealing clothing, such as yoga pants paired with long shirts. My father's controlling nature was particularly stifling, making every disagreement feel like it was entirely my fault. At home, my mother was perpetually dissatisfied with what she perceived as my lack of contribution to household chores. In reality, I was diligently assisting from an early age, managing multiple loads of laundry daily, maintaining one of the bathrooms, handling the dishes, and keeping the floors spotless. Despite my unwavering dedication, my efforts were never acknowledged, leaving me feeling invisible and unappreciated within my own home. I strictly adhered to my parents' rules. I avoided alcohol, steered clear of drugs, and meticulously dressed in a manner they approved of. Socializing with friends, even for something as innocent as a birthday party, was off limits. I often found myself staying late at school under various pretexts, simply to escape the oppressive environment of my home and enjoy some semblance of normalcy. Everything changed dramatically when my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Despite our strained relationship, I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. My mother, however, showed no such sentiment. She abruptly abandoned my father, leaving him to grapple with his illness alone. My father and I were left in shock as we watched her pack her bags and walk away, effectively severing ties with our family. My father, who had always appeared strong and stoic, broke down in despair one evening on the porch. At just 14 years old, I understood the depth of his pain. In an attempt to comfort him, I fetched a beer from the fridge, a simple gesture that marked the beginning of a significant shift in our relationship. From that day forward, my father transformed from the controlling figure he once was into a supportive and loving parent, stepping up to fill the void my mother had left behind. Shortly after my parents' divorce, which was expedited by a prenuptial agreement that prevented my mother from claiming alimony, she quickly remarried her high school sweetheart, Morty. This new relationship was fraught with tension and resentment. My mother resented spending weekends with me, often concocting excuses to avoid seeing me when my father would drop me off. It felt as though she had divorced me along with my father, further deepening the emotional chasm between us. Amidst this turmoil, my grandmother remained a beacon of love and stability. She continued to visit regularly, inviting me and my cousins for monthly sleepovers at her house, moments that remain some of my most cherished memories. 5 months into my parents' divorce, my mother tied the knot again, this time with Morty, who had purchased a home in hopes of starting a new family. However, my mother's intentions were anything but genuine. During my infrequent visits, I often found her engrossed in conversations on her phone, laughing and talking to someone behind Morty's back. It became evident that she was unfaithful, leading to a significant confrontation between Morty and her when he discovered her infidelity. Despite the revelation, my mother managed to convince Morty that her actions were merely a one-time lapse, and they remained together. During this period, my father's health continued to deteriorate under the relentless progression of his cancer. In his final days, he made every effort to spend time with me, a stark contrast to his previous indifference, reinforcing the bond we were now rebuilding. Tragically, one night, my father passed away quietly in his sleep after months of ineffective chemotherapy. The news devastated me, and my grandmother and my father's family were the first to offer their support as I grappled with the overwhelming grief. When my mother arrived for the funeral, she did so alone, without Morty by her side, revealing that she had continued her affair with another man even after Morty's departure. Throughout the funeral, my mother callously remarked that my father's death couldn't have come at a worse time, given her own burdens. Her lack of empathy shocked and angered everyone present, casting a shadow over the somber proceedings. Upon my father's passing, his will declared that all his assets would be allocated to me immediately. My mother showed a sudden and intense interest in reconnecting with me, but my grandmother was vehemently opposed to me living with my mother, fully aware of her true intentions to exploit my inheritance. Together with my aunt, my grandmother orchestrated the sale of all my father's assets to establish a college trust fund in my name. However, because I was still a minor, my mother's name had to be included as a beneficiary. Morty, my mother's husband, soon divorced her due to the lack of a prenuptial agreement, resulting in her receiving a substantial settlement. My grandmother advised her not to interfere with my trust fund, highlighting that she already had her own financial stability. My mother reluctantly agreed to this arrangement, though the tension between us remained palpable. Living with my mother after the divorce felt alien and isolating. She had transformed into someone unrecognizable, behaving irresponsibly like a teenager. Every night, she would dress up, go out partying, and return home late with unfamiliar men, taking them into her bedroom. Mornings were chaotic as I navigated the presence of different strangers in our home, each visit leaving me more unsettled. When I turned 16, my mother introduced me to her third husband, Joe. From the outset, it was clear that Joe harbored a strong dislike for me. His demeanor was harsh and overly critical, and whenever I confronted my mother about his behavior, she would defend him, leading to increased tension and covert hostility within our household. 10 months later, when my baby brother Brad was born, my mother's narrative shifted dramatically. She portrayed Joe as a fundamentally good person who struggled with emotional expression, urging me to be more understanding and less resentful. Ironically, Joe lavished affection on Brad, ignoring me completely. My mother confided in me several times that she had little in common with Joe and had only married him for the sake of providing a stable family environment. This facade was quickly shattered as my mother and Joe engaged in frequent, bitter arguments, especially after Brad's arrival. Joe became increasingly resentful, limiting my mother's time with me and vocally expressing his disdain for our relationship. His cruel remarks, like wishing I had died alongside my father or suggesting I live with my grandmother to ensure Brad received all the love and attention, were deeply hurtful and took a significant toll on my mental well-being. Despite my pleas and attempts to question my mother about her continued marriage to Joe, she deftly changed the subject, leaving me frustrated and confused. One evening, my mother and Joe left us with my grandmother to attend a social gathering with their friends. Initially, these outings were infrequent, but they soon became a regular occurrence, happening almost every weekend. Typically, they would ask me to watch over Brad while they were out, but one particular night, I was engrossed in studying for an important exam and had to juggle both responsibilities. We ended up staying at my grandmother's house since my parents didn't return by the agreed-upon time of 11 p.m. As the night dragged on and my parents remained absent, anxiety set in. My exam the next day was crucial, and Brad needed to be put to bed on time to avoid Joe's wrath. My grandmother tried contacting them, leaving 3 increasingly frustrated messages by midnight. Eventually, my parents arrived, visibly intoxicated and giggling uncontrollably. It was shocking to see them drive so recklessly under the influence. Joe took Brad while my mother hurriedly instructed me to gather my things so we could leave. However, my grandmother was having none of it. She confronted them about their tardiness and drunken state, refusing to allow Joe to take Brad in such a condition. She insisted we call an Uber and leave the car at her place instead. Joe, visibly angry and still inebriated, began arguing with my grandmother, claiming she had no right to interfere and asserting his authority as Brad's father. The situation quickly escalated into a heated exchange of curses and insults. My mother, too intoxicated to process the gravity of the situation, stood by silently, adding to the rising tension. Desperate to calm everyone down and protect Brad from the escalating conflict, I implored them to stop, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. The confrontation intensified as Joe hurled more derogatory remarks at both my grandmother and me, revealing his deep-seated animosity. In a moment of sheer frustration, my grandmother threatened to call the police. Fueled by anger and alcohol, Joe did the unthinkable. He slapped my grandmother across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the room, and I couldn't help but scream in horror, begging him to stop. Joe showed no remorse, continuing his assault until Brad began to cry, traumatized by the unfolding violence. My grandmother, clutching her bruised cheek, demanded that I call the police, while my mother stood frozen, unable to respond. In the midst of my panic and tears, I managed to contact the 911 operator, who stayed on the line with me until the authorities arrived. As the sirens approached, Joe's panic became evident. He desperately begged my grandmother not to press charges, claiming it would ruin both his and my mother's lives. Despite his pleas, the police arrested him for assault, and he was taken away in handcuffs. My mother, once again, froze in place, beginning to cry and berate him instead of supporting me. My grandmother sternly warned her that unless she divorced Joe, she would involve Child Protective Services, risking the custody of both Brad and me. Terrified, my mother nodded in agreement, realizing the severity of the situation. Later, I discovered that Joe and my mother had been using drugs in addition to alcohol, which explained her subdued behavior that night. My mother's decision to leave without properly resting was influenced by her altered state, unlike Joe, whose actions that night were far more destructive. In the aftermath, Brad and I stayed with my grandmother, as I couldn't bear to remain with my mother after witnessing Joe's abusive behavior. The following day, my mother finally came to her senses, recognizing the gravity of Joe's actions. She promptly filed for divorce and barred him from ever seeing us again. When the rest of the family learned of Joe's assault, they were outraged by my mother's previous complacency and questioned why she hadn't acted sooner. My aunt and uncle expressed their frustration, leading to a heated confrontation where they vowed never to speak to her again over Joe's actions. Given that Joe was a first-time offender, the court sentenced him to probation, mandated counseling, and enforced a restraining order to keep him away from us. He made numerous attempts to seek forgiveness from my mother, but she remained steadfast, ultimately divorcing him and securing a favorable settlement. I chose not to stay with my mother after the incident, moving all my belongings to my grandmother's home while Brad remained with her. My mother was displeased with this arrangement, as she relied on me to babysit Brad, but she couldn't voice her objections without facing my grandmother's wrath. As the years progressed, I celebrated my 18th birthday with immense joy, looking forward to embracing adulthood and embarking on a new chapter in my life. However, tragedy struck once more when my grandmother passed away from an unexpected heart attack just a week after my birthday. Her passing left the entire family in mourning, and she had left behind a will that divided her assets among my mother and aunt. She equally distributed her valuable heirlooms and jewelry among her children and allocated funds to my cousin's college trust funds. For me, she bequeathed her most prized possession, the keys to her house, recognizing our close bond and my role as the primary caregiver. This generous act shocked my mother, who felt it was unfair that I received such a significant inheritance while Brad was left with nothing. She criticized my grandmother for her perceived favoritism, labeling her as selfish for not providing for Brad as well. In response, I defended my grandmother's decisions, arguing that she had given me something invaluable, a home filled with love and memories. My mother's anger flared as she accused me of bringing up past grievances, prompting me to stand my ground and refuse her suggestion to sell my grandmother's house and move in with her. I expressed my deep love for the house and the irreplaceable memories it held, making it clear that I would never part with it for financial gain. My mother attempted to persuade me otherwise, but I remained resolute, finding solace and peace in my new living situation away from her toxicity. Living independently at my grandmother's house proved to be a transformative experience. Surrounded by supportive family members, I began to heal from the traumas of my past. I dedicated time to self-reflection and attended therapy to cope with the grief of losing my grandmother and the lingering pain from my tumultuous relationship with my mother. Deciding to take a gap year, I planned to focus on my personal growth and recovery. However, as an adult, I needed to sever my mother's legal ties to my trust fund. This required her signature to access the funds and remove her as a beneficiary. 2 months ago, I approached my mother with this request. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robin, who seemed pleasant but significantly younger than her previous partners. Sensing potential manipulation, I decided to discuss the matter privately. I expected a smooth conversation about my rightful inheritance, the money my father had left for my education. Instead, my mother reacted with panic and resistance, refusing to let me take control of my finances. Her erratic behavior raised my suspicions, prompting me to consult a lawyer. The legal review confirmed my fears. My mother had been systematically depleting my trust fund over the years and had recently drained the account entirely. The realization of her betrayal left me feeling utterly devastated and betrayed. Consumed by anger and grief, I decided to take action. Learning that my mother was planning yet another wedding with Robin provided the perfect opportunity for retribution. I orchestrated a family meeting, rallying my cousins and trusted relatives by presenting evidence of her financial misconduct. Together, we devised a plan to publicly shame her at the wedding, exposing her deceit in front of everyone. When the day of the wedding arrived, I attended wearing the custom-made t-shirt that boldly labeled my mother as a gold digger in bright red letters. My outfit took everyone by surprise, especially Robin and his family, who were unaware of the unfolding drama. As my side of the family was already in on the plan, we were prepared for the confrontation. As the ceremony progressed, and the priest opened the floor for objections, I knew it was my moment. Alongside my aunt, uncle, and cousins, I raised my hand to voice our disapproval. As I stood up, the realization of the t-shirt's message dawned on my mother, her face flushing with embarrassment amidst the shocked murmurs of the guests. Seizing the moment, I publicly accused her of embezzling funds from my college trust, presenting the documents that proved her betrayal. I emphasized how her actions had deprived me of the financial means necessary for my education, questioning why she would steal from her own daughter after 3 failed marriages and ample alimony from previous unions. The audience gasped as Robin, clearly confused and unaware of the extent of her deceit, questioned her about her supposed third marriage, revealing a discrepancy in her story. My mother reacted with rage, dismissing my accusations as childish and denying any wrongdoing. She insisted that as my mother, she had every right to the money, claiming it was her duty to support me financially. Robin interjected, asking if this was the reason behind their extravagant wedding expenses, given that my mother was covering all the costs. Her silence in response was a tacit admission of guilt. The situation spiraled into chaos as my relatives expressed their outrage, with some even getting physical in their confrontations with her. The turmoil reached its peak, prompting someone to call the police. When law enforcement arrived, my mother continued to shout and resist, leading to her arrest on charges of embezzlement and financial fraud. At the police station, I provided my statement alongside my aunt, solidifying the case against her. Despite the gravity of the situation, I found it hard to believe that my own mother could betray me so profoundly. The aftermath of her arrest was a mix of relief and sorrow, as distant relatives expressed concern and indignation over the lengths I had gone to bring her to justice. While some questioned whether involving the entire family was excessive, my immediate family stood firmly by my side, recognizing the necessity of my actions. In a heartfelt update, I expressed gratitude for the support I received, admitting that I had grappled with feelings of guilt and disbelief over my mother's betrayal. My uncle had stepped in to help secure a competent lawyer, ensuring that we could pursue the legal battle to recover my stolen funds. My primary goal remained to reclaim as much of my college trust fund as possible. I also provided reassurance about Brad, who was coping with the situation by staying with Joe and his family, still too young to fully comprehend the complexities of our family dynamics. 6 months have passed since the initial turmoil, and significant progress has been made in the legal proceedings. The court ruled decisively in my favor, mandating that my mother repay every penny she had embezzled from my college trust fund. Despite her tearful pleas and desperate attempts to seek leniency, the judge remained unwavering, ordering her to liquidate all her assets, including her house, to fulfill her financial obligations to me. This legal victory has been a beacon of hope amidst the emotional turmoil, providing a sense of closure and justice. Reflecting on these events, I found solace in the memories of my grandmother and father, whose legacies inspired me to stand up against injustice and reclaim my rightful inheritance. 3 months into the resolution of the case, my mother's actions had fully come to light. She had repaid the entire amount embezzled from my trust fund, fulfilling the court's orders. The emotional burden of the past few months led me to make the difficult decision to permanently sever ties with my mother. This choice was supported by the rest of my family, who also decided to distance themselves from her manipulative behavior. Despite her attempts to reach out, hoping for forgiveness and reconciliation, I remained steadfast in my decision to protect my well-being and honor the memory of my grandmother. As I look forward to the future, I find myself exploring new opportunities and considering my next steps for 2024. My gap year has been a period of profound personal growth and healing, allowing me to overcome past traumas and rebuild my life. Spending time with my cousins and other supportive family members has been instrumental in my journey towards recovery. With the legal battles behind me and a clear path ahead, I am optimistic about the future and determined to create a life filled with resilience, independence, and the cherished memories of those who have shaped me. Throughout this journey, suspense and uncertainty have been constant companions. Each revelation about my mother's deceit added layers of complexity to our already fractured relationship. The courtroom battles, the public confrontation at the wedding, and the ongoing struggle to reclaim my inheritance were all fraught with tension and emotional upheaval. The support from my extended family provided a crucial lifeline, offering both strength and validation as I navigated the murky waters of betrayal and reconciliation. The character dynamics in this story are intricate and deeply intertwined. My grandmother's unwavering support contrasted sharply with my mother's manipulative behavior, highlighting the stark differences in their personalities and motivations. Joe's introduction into our lives brought an additional layer of conflict, as his antagonistic stance towards me and his abusive behavior towards my grandmother further destabilized our family structure. The emergence of my mother's new boyfriend, Robin, added yet another dimension of complexity, as his presence was a constant reminder of her ongoing deceit and instability. The suspense peaked during the night of the confrontation at my grandmother's house. The tension between my parents, fueled by alcohol and unresolved resentment, created a volatile environment that seemed on the brink of eruption. The dramatic escalation to physical violence not only underscored the depth of the familial rifts but also served as a catalyst for the subsequent legal actions that would forever alter our lives. The arrival of the police and Joe's subsequent arrest were pivotal moments that marked the beginning of the end for my mother's manipulative reign over our family. As the story unfolds, the legal battle becomes a central element, driving the narrative forward with its own suspenseful twists and turns. The court's decisive ruling in my favor was a moment of triumph, yet it was tempered by the emotional scars left by years of betrayal and abuse. The aftermath of the court's decision brought its own challenges, as I grappled with the reality of severing ties with my mother and the emotional toll of her actions on my family and me. The emotional landscape of this story is rich and varied, encompassing feelings of betrayal, anger, grief, and ultimately, resilience. The loss of my grandmother added a poignant layer to the narrative, highlighting the transient nature of life and the enduring impact of familial bonds. Her legacy of strength and support served as a guiding light as I navigated the darkest moments of my life, inspiring me to seek justice and reclaim my autonomy. In conclusion, this journey has been one of profound transformation, marked by relentless challenges and hard-won victories. The intricate web of family relationships, the harrowing experiences of betrayal and abuse, and the ultimate triumph over adversity have all contributed to shaping who I am today. As I move forward, I carry with me the lessons learned and the strength gained from overcoming such immense obstacles. The path ahead is filled with promise and the possibility of a brighter future, one where I can honor the memories of my grandmother and father by building a life of integrity, independence, and resilience.